There you go. Good afternoon, everybody. We are going to get started. And good afternoon to all of you online. So welcome to this very special presentation of the CFAR Clinical Core. We are just so delighted to have Kevin DeCock here as our special guest this week. Kevin has had a long and storied career in global health. I could tell you a lot about it, but if I did, then you wouldn't go out and read his book. So I won't tell you many of the details, but I'll say that he got his medical training in Bristol, England. He did a fellowship at University of Southern California in hepatology, way ahead of his time there, Dave. He joined the Epidemic Intelligence Service at the CDC. I learned last night in 1988, he came to Johns Hopkins and spoke with John Bartlett about an ID fellowship, but elected to go back to the CDC. And then over the ensuing years has been all over the world, including a stint at the Global Program on AIDS at the WHO, a teaching stint at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and field or office chief of party or whatever in Kenya for the CDC for many years. So, this is his second book that he's written. And 2 years ago, he was here talking about his first book, and how he found the strength and time to write a second is a mystery, but we're going to hear all about it. I'll just say in the mid-1990s, Kevin and I ended up on the circuit together, going around the world to AIDS meetings, where he would talk about tuberculosis and I would talk about Mycobacterium avium. For you youngsters in the room, Mycobacterium avium is an infection that we used to see a lot of, but don't anymore. So I was able finally to move over to the tuberculosis side, and Kevin and I began collaborating back in the mid to late 90s. In any event, it's just a real pleasure to have him here. We're looking forward to hearing all about your adventures in global health and your deployment to epidemics around the world. So welcome, Kevin.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dick, for the kind introduction, and thank you for hosting me here. It really is a pleasure. I have been to Hopkins several times and really have such a regard for this institution. And I guess my first meeting was with Tom Quinn, which we were talking about last night, back in 1986, of all places, in Kinshasa. Quite a memorable time. Am I doing the right things here? Obviously not. Okay, thank you. So I can just use that arrow. Great. The first thing they tell you if you're trying to promote a book, and I'm giving various talks in different places. By the way, there's a talk on Monday, CSIS in Washington, 4 o'clock, free food and drink. Very important. The first thing they tell you when you're sort of promoting a book is don't talk about any other book. But I'm breaking that rule. Dick mentioned it. Dick had COVID when I talked about that previous book. Dispatches from the AIDS Pandemic. It was published in 2023. I mention it for two reasons. One is in Deployed, I don't talk about HIV that much, which I actually spent most of my time working on. So it would have been redundant to go over some of that and explain what CDC is and so on. But another reason to mention it is it's written with Harold Jaffe and Jim Curran, and it's about the AIDS epidemic seen through the eyes of CDC over the years. And what I wanted to emphasize was that writing with Harold and with Jim was just such a privilege. I mean, these are people I had such a high regard for, and I always say to younger people, students and fellows and so on, choose your heroes carefully. The issue of mentorship is so important. Nobody has it all, so you have to look for different attributes. But they were very influential for me.
Get that thing out of the way.
Deployed is it's not a memoir, because Johns Hopkins University Press doesn't do memoirs. They say that very specifically. So if you call it a memoir, they might retract it. So I have to be careful about that. But it's I guess it's really, it's a book about transitions in some way. Certainly some personal ones, from boy to student to doctor to international work. The transition from the old tropical medicine to what we understand today as global health, from little funding to quite a lot of funding, and then the transitions that we're seeing over the last 24 hours. Thanks, Matt. Have you fixed it? Thank you very much. Probably the most important person here, Matt. It was
Sorry, now I got to get you back on there.
okay.
Okay, now
Right.
you can.
So I can, yeah, okay. Deployed was published in November of last year, Hopkins University Press, who were really very, very helpful. But if anybody ever tries publishing a book, it's kind of an interesting experience. The emergency room, this is not with the publishers. Kind of like some of it is kind of the speed of the Vatican. But they were genuinely helpful. And once in production, they were extremely efficient. So it's organized into three parts: clinician, epidemiologist, and bureaucrat. And I use the term bureaucrat not in a pejorative sense at all. And there is a prologue and an epilogue. Just as background, and the first part, clinician, includes some personal background, and it's really about clinical medicine. I had a slightly unusual background, which I guess, our backgrounds do affect what happens to us later. There's a message here saying, do I need to do anything about that, Matt?
We can throw her.
There's a message saying you're talking rubbish. None of this is true. Our backgrounds obviously do influence us, and I had an unusually international one because I was born in Belgium. I have two nationalities, Belgian and American. My father was a surgeon of the very old school, the people who really did everything. He was a big fish in a small pond, and my mother was American, and they married in 1940 at the beginning of the war, and she stayed in Belgium for the rest of her life, and she was not. She wasn't liberal, neither was she excessively conservative, but she really believed in the special role of the United States, its leadership and its special attributes. But we were sent to boarding school in England at the age of 7, which was kind of a Dickensian experience. And I mean, I couldn't speak English when I went. I only spoke Flemish. And it was, these things do unquestionably affect one, but also provided, I guess, somewhat of a background for international work. So I specialized in internal medicine. And another thing I emphasize to younger people particularly is the importance of those early years, because if you read people's obituaries, they say, well, she was the director of this and he was the chair of that department and so on. But it's some of that early stuff that is very difficult and so foundational for everything that happens later. So I mean, for me, for example, becoming a member of the Royal College of Physicians, which in the UK, where I trained, is kind of the equivalent of the boards in internal medicine, except with a lot of clinical exams and so on, and truly, truly difficult. Another phrase that I came across somewhere along the road was a kind of a saying that I thought was rather wise and applies to medicine, but more broadly also, is that you see only what you look for and you recognize only what you know. The reason I include that, and it relates particularly to our mistakes, which I think we need to accept more, talk about more, and certainly learn from. The reason I include that chest X-ray is an example of that. It's actually my first encounter with cardiac tamponade, a misdiagnosis the first time, fortunately not fatal, but didn't miss it the second time in a very different environment. I had the dubious distinction or privilege of having to register for two different military draft systems, US and Belgium. And this was the time of the Vietnam War. They never actually took anybody from overseas, but I did have to do the Belgian obligation. But you were able to work in a low-income country as an alternative service. And I was fortunate and happenstance, got a job as a lecturer in medicine, like an assistant professor, teaching internal medicine at the University of Nairobi in Kenya, and working at the University Hospital, Kenyatta National Hospital. And this truly was life-changing. I had prepared myself by doing a degree in tropical medicine at that's actually the School of Tropical Medicine in Liverpool. I think it was Europe's earliest school, founded in the late 19th century. And of course, these schools were set up for the needs of the colonial empires. When I started working in Kenya, after some time, I realized actually that we were dealing with three types of disease. Most common in those days, this was 79 to 82, the most common were actually diseases of poverty, mainly infectious, pneumonia, tuberculosis, meningitis, dysentery. Second, you saw the kinds of conditions that clinicians see everywhere: hypertension, cancer, diabetes, but all of it with kind of interestingly different epidemiology. And then thirdly, the classic tropical diseases, which I didn't realize, but quickly did realize, were very focal in their distribution because of the ecology and needs of the parasites and vectors. And you really had to sort of know what happens where to make sensible interpretations. And the terms geographical medicine and geographical pathology, which you don't hear very much anymore, actually had meaning. Again, I always say to younger folks, you're very fortunate if you study at an institution such as this, because you get taught how to do things right. I realized that in that kind of chaotic environment, it was possible to formulate a question, collect information, data, and draw generalizable conclusions, which of course is the definition of research. But I had to sort of teach myself to do it and look back at sort of, my goodness. The reason I include these slides, and I'm going to talk fairly fast because I want to have a conversation and open it up for questions. But so these photographs all have some kind of meaning from the book, but I won't cover them all. But just as an aside, this enzyme, these different categories of enzyme immunoassay results were from actually my doctoral thesis, my PhD-like thesis, which I wrote after all of this. Clearly, you see that there's a difference between this category and all the others. That was actually visceral an ELISA for visceral leishmaniasis, and investigations of the cause of chronic splenomegaly. But I managed to write this thesis without actually about that kind of stuff, including that kind of stuff, without actually being able to define sensitivity, specificity, predictive value, or even mentioning the terms in the whole thesis. But the examiners obviously didn't know either. Lots of interesting anecdotes, lessons, but moving on. It was important in those days to get your BA, been to America. And I, as Dick mentioned, did a fellowship and then stayed on the faculty at USC. And you know, as you get slightly more experienced and so on, you start seeing beyond just the technical work and start seeing some of the sort of social, political implications, etc. A quick couple of anecdotes. We had that unit was a very large clinical liver disease unit, must have been one of the biggest in the world, and we had very deep clinical hepatitis experience, and including and perhaps especially, and I did a lot of work on this, on hepatitis delta virus infection. Sobering, we wrote a lot of papers, but it's kind of sobering that with time, they never get quoted anymore. But you know, one thing we did, which as I was leaving that unit, we had an extensive serum bank and tested our hepatitis serum bank for HIV. and actually showed that, that HIV was present in Los Angeles in a man with chronic hepatitis B 2 years before the description of AIDS, the famous description in 1981 in the MMWR. Showed a lot of some other important stuff in that paper, so evidence that Delta was obviously being transmitted sexually amongst gay men. Published it in the American Journal of Epidemiology, which was my choice, which was great, really prestigious academic journal, with the only problem that nobody reads it. But today that's probably less important with electronic searching and so on. But I always thought, we could have been famous with that paper. But it was from there that I went to the CDC. There was another, if I may go back, I think another important observation, actually, that unit, which was one of it was run by a triumvirate, each of whom was world famous. But that unit has essentially disappeared and been absorbed into the GI unit at USC. And there were three things, I think, relevant to that. Firstly, the leaders never thought about transition planning, and young people came and went, but there was no space. Secondly, they never made the links with basic science. So this was the time of the emergence of molecular biology. We had good diagnostics, but not the molecular stuff. And they sort of missed out on that. And thirdly, the big advance, of course, in clinical liver disease was transplantation. And USC, one of the most expensive universities, rich university in this country, used as its teaching hospital LA County Hospital, which is, for the indigent. 50% of the patients were Spanish speaking, many undocumented, not the kind of environment that a transplant program would be set up and thrive. So it's kind of interesting to see what happens to departments, academic departments, organizations, and so on. It was an interesting experience. So it was from there that I went to the CDC and became a medical epidemiologist, and learned, or sort of realized after a while that, gee, I think I've left clinical medicine and I'm now doing epidemiology and public health. And the second part of the book describes a number of important experiences with the lessons therefrom. On the left of the slide, I won't go into detail with this, other than to say that from my first experience, literally I'd only been there about 2 months, going to northern Zaire, the Democratic Republic of Congo, to the area where the first outbreak of Ebola had ever been recognized 10 years before, from whom we had sera, which were able to be tested. And long story short, I guess what technically was a retrospective cohort study, which a term I would not have recognized at that time, and rather implausibly ended up with a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine that's actually been quite important in the history of the evolution of HIV and the virus. But an unusual experience that sort of had more in common with a Graham Greene novel than an epidemiologic investigation, but an important experience. The real sort of first typical CDC experience I had was literally immediately after that, which being called to Nigeria for what was initially an unknown epidemic, turned out to be due to yellow fever. And it showed, again, a couple of observations. Firstly, a privilege working at CDC, just because of the things we were drawn into and the people you worked with. The man you see sitting at a table there on the right, on the far end of the slide, doing an enzyme in an ELISA test on our kitchen table, was Tom Moneth, who unquestionably is the leading expert in the world on yellow fever. And to do field work with somebody like that and just to watch and to learn, it was really quite extraordinary, and a real privilege. Quick couple of other observations. A clinical one, the boy at the bottom of the slide, not him, but I was shown somebody else, or another case, with an ulcer on his shoulder, And I was asked, we were visiting doctors, and so, what is that? Could you help? What is this? And it's an ulcer on the shoulder. Of course, this is more a clearer example. This, of course, is guinea worm. One of the two diseases slated for eradication. The other, of course, is polio. The two diseases that actually have been eradicated being obviously smallpox and rinderpest, which is a measles-like illness in ruminants. Both these programs, unexpected obstacles, funding issues, and we're not there, and almost eradicated doesn't really count. The epidemic curve merits a couple of comments. Firstly, my naivete, I drew that. That's actually the curve we drew in the field. It's unorthodox, of course, because epidemic curves should be drawn with histograms, not with lines like that. But it was enough, and this is one of two experiences where I've been able to have a piece of paper just like that with a drawing on it or with a curve and go to some senior decision maker and say, explain what it is and have major action following. So we took this curve after just a couple of days. These two colleagues of mine over by the, what's it called, the No Hurry in Life Hotel. The three of us had, never having seen yellow fever in our lives, had stumbled into the epicenter and sort of agreed that this has to be yellow fever and can't be anything else. I'd never seen it, but that was the conclusion. And going to the military governor of the state with that piece of paper and saying, we have to have mass vaccination here. And the only group that can do this, has the logistics, is the army. And he agreed. Didn't happen very efficiently or completely, but this was all fairly intoxicating. I thought, gee, I'm an EIS officer and we've mobilized the army. And it was a very memorable experience when Tom Monash showed up a bit later and said to me, I introduced myself, and I said, he said to me, it's really bad, isn't it? I said, yes, it's very bad. He said, I don't think this is yellow fever. But fortunately, he changed his mind about 24 hours later. I won't talk, for the sake of time, I won't talk about the proximal part of the slide. Other than to say something I should have said earlier, I do always encourage younger folks to, especially as I was more senior at CDC, to document what they're doing, especially the importance of field work and the importance of writing it down. And in epidemiology, we're rather dismissive of case reports, understandably, but sometimes they can be really important. 5 cases of pneumocystis is how the world learned about AIDS. And, the smart clinician in Florida who recognized anthrax meningitis and heralded bioterrorism attack in the United States. What this is about is a concern, it's in the book, a concern that there was anthrax in Kenya from powder, and there wasn't. What I did get exposed to, never having sort of been interested particularly in environmental health and not knowing anything about it, we were drawn into a very large outbreak of aflatoxin poisoning. Again, people dying with jaundice in an area south of Nairobi. Aflatoxin is a toxin produced by a mold, Aspergillus flavus, that grows on moldy maize, peanuts, and so on. And there was, a large outbreak in a very difficult area, totally underprivileged, very few medical resources. And we really, got involved in this in depth. Very good collaboration from headquarters, lots of other international attention, all sorts of organizations involved. A very sobering experience because good epidemiology, as always, asking the right question is critically important. And the right question here was, is this problem of aflatoxin poisoning simply a local problem where maize is being grown locally and stored under damp conditions in inadequate housing in the dark? Or is it actually a point source epidemic that's actually from some central location bad maize is being distributed much more widespread and really over the whole country. So we learned an awful lot about the dynamics of maize marketing, very complicated. And it fortunately, with good epidemiology and a case control study, we showed very clearly it was local. But this was the second time that a simple epidemic curve shown, this time with the American ambassador present and to the Minister of Health explaining what this was, and the look of fear on her face as she realized, A, this was her constituency where this was all happening, and B, that, you know, if she's going to have to explain this to the president and might be facing a countrywide problem. Aflatoxin, but you know, fortunately it was local. And there were lots of follow-ups and meetings, and even a meeting in Geneva about it and so on, but relatively little happened, and it was soon forgotten. There are a couple of important conclusions about this. I found it very sobering that we were able to do all this good epidemiology, good public health work, but the solution is not medical or public health, because it's poverty, it's agriculture, it's regulations, it's food inspection, etc., etc. And really, what were we doing? We were just bearing witness, if you will, which is important, and which is probably, you know, one of the leading duties, if you will, of epidemiology and public health. But it was as I said, a sobering experience. I often say that, you know, the most extraordinary thing I've seen in the years of work was watching the emergence of the AIDS epidemic and then seeing the impact of antiretroviral therapy. But up there with that sort of magnitude of things that, you know, you're impacted by was the outbreak of Ebola in West Africa from 2014 to 2016. And I had the good fortune to be CDC team lead on 3 separate occasions of extended deployments to Liberia. I went to the other affected countries, Sierra Leone and Guinea as well, but spent most of my time in Liberia. And I was able to see the beginning, the middle, the beginning of the very bad time, the middle and the end of this epidemic. I have no idea how valid that epidemic curve is. I doubt it's certainly not completely accurate. The estimated number was about 28,000 cases of Ebola, about 11 or 12,000 deaths. In blue is Guinea. It started in Guinea and it finished in Guinea. Sierra Leone in yellow had the largest outbreak, and Liberia, the shortest lasting one. Many experiences, a chapter in the book on that. And then I got involved also in the second largest outbreak, which is in Congo, in 2018 to 2020. I was there 2019. Very different and difficult situation because of security issues. This was in Eastern Congo, which, as you know, is still even now plagued by insecurity and violence and stuff, and very, very difficult working there. I do want to pay tribute to NIH and Cliff Lane and colleagues and the folks on the ground, nationals and internationals, who managed to do a clinical trial on therapeutics for Ebola, monoclonal antibodies, Regeneron, under the most difficult conditions. And yet they did a really important clinical randomized clinical trial, which got published in the New England Journal and has affected the practice. And of course, we now have a vaccine as well, so it's a bit of a different game. But Ebola epidemiology really has changed. There's probably been about 30 recognized outbreaks since 1976, probably a cumulative number, about 35,000 cases recognized. But over 95% of those have all happened since 2014. We've seen geographic extension much further west than before. Vast geographic areas covered recently, in urban epidemics, including capital cities, international staff infected and evacuated, etc., etc. And it's a completely different situation. Really, Ebola has gone from being some remote tropical infection to something that really is important in global health security. And there's two chapters in the book on Ebola. And I wasn't going to write about COVID, but the book gets reviewed and re-reviewed and reviewed again, and then I was told, no, you have to. So what I ended up doing, it was a difficult chapter to write, and I'd value any comments if anybody reads any of this, because nobody says to people say to you, oh yes, very good work, yes, but nobody actually tells you this. I think this is rubbish. This was difficult, and what I decided to do was, as a CDC insider, but outside, because I was in Kenya, to sort of look back and say what happened in the United States, and specifically what happened at CDC. And, I hope I get the balance right. There was this kind of original sin that happened early on, January and February of 2020, with the problem about diagnostics that were released. And that has been difficult to forget about. But as you all know, CDC has had a very difficult time in the last few years. What's interesting, and then the second part of that chapter is about Kenya, what happened there. And a couple of observations. Firstly, I thought initially that Africa was just going to be devastated by this epidemic, and that we were seeing the scenes from New York and from Italy, and I thought, Lord, what's going to happen here? And well, it didn't happen. The cases that were reported, that were recognized, behaved just like everywhere else. Deaths concentrated in the elderly, 10 people of 50 and above, 10 times increased risk of dying compared to younger people. Very extensive asymptomatic infection, later shown to be the case. Waves of epidemics, different variants and so on. So it behaved very similarly. But what saved Africa is age, because I'm absolutely persuaded by this, because the median age in Kenya is 20. There's other countries where it's 16, in West Africa, Niger or so. So you don't have this concentration of older people. And I'm persuaded that that's the main explanation for probably an underestimated mortality, but nonetheless not the mortality that we saw elsewhere. So the final part of the book, bureaucrat, it's, again, not a pejorative term, but there's a chapter on health diplomacy and one on health bureaucracy. And I discuss my observations on issues of leadership and administration and the organizational performance, et cetera, with, based on time at WHO, time at CDC, some of the comparisons, and some general observations. And perhaps the most important one is actually people are people and organizations are organizations, and they're pretty much the same across the world. And people's motivations and so on are essentially the same in very different environments. And talent is pretty equally distributed, but opportunity is not. And I included a chapter on tuberculosis. May seem somewhat out of place, but I don't think it is. Because firstly, it's, as Dick alluded to it, it's sort of a disease that I have found has pursued me, or that I've been involved with in one way or another over very many years. And it's one of those diseases, you could also say, well, cholera, syphilis, certainly congenital syphilis, that it's kind of a barometer of, how well is society doing? Is all well? And I think it's a useful indicator in that regard. And then final two slides, reflections, in the epilogue and to some extent in the prologue about the nature and evolution of global health. Some of the forces that we're going to have to face or are facing already, many of them interacting, obviously epidemiology, politics, economics, but issues such as migration, climate, conflict, many interactions between some of these, and just some thoughts of, what would you say to your younger self? And comment on the current contradictions. I include that etching for somewhat sentimental reasons. It's one of my first memories in life, actually. My father had it hanging in his study in Belgium. It was drawn by an Austrian artist called Ivo Saliger, who drew it in about 1920 on the death of his sister from leukemia or lymphoma. And, it really, it's the physician fighting death with uncertain outcome. And I've often thought it useful as a reminder for us in public health that actually we shouldn't forget that the basis of our work in health is one person in danger or distress, reaching out for help. And tuberculosis elimination or scaling up treatment for AIDS. Yes, we have these huge targets, but they're achieved one by one, and we should remember that. And then finally, in these difficult times, and we are facing difficult times, with the assault, frankly, on public health and science that we're seeing, over the past year, I sort of thought from literature, there's sort of a couple of analogies or themes that have struck me. One, of course, is the myth from the Greek mythology, the myth of Sisyphus, condemned to the afterlife to push his rock up a hill and to have it roll down again to the bottom when he reaches the top. And I sort of thought, is that how we are in global health? I think not. I think we're not in as dire a situation as Sisyphus, but clearly there is, a danger of rolling back, and deep thought, especially by the countries affected, needs to be given to how to stop the rock rolling further. And the second thing, second thought I had was relating to a novel, The Leopard, which is an Italian novel written about 80 years ago. And by the Netflix actually has they have a series on this, which I read about last year. It made me reread this book. It's a good series to watch, and it's pretty loyal to the book, not completely, but it got very well reviewed. But there's a very famous quote that in that book that it's about a noble family, Italy in the late 19th century. And one of the characters says, if we want things to stay the same, things will have to change. And I think that's profoundly wise in relation to the situation we're in. Because if you think of CDC, for example, I believe that we will, things will change. We're not going to stay like this. I can't believe that this country, with all its history and its, huge contributions, will always have this anti-science kind of background. But when we get through all of this, now I think is the time to start thinking, well, what do we want? Because I don't think things will go back to how they were before, and probably should not. But that's food for thought. But let me stop there. Thank you for. Oh, and buy the book.
Go away, don't go away. So we're limited because we can't sit with microphones because of the audio in this room. So we're just going to stand here. I'm going to make a comment and ask a question, and then we'll open it up to everyone else. The comment is, I didn't know this, but in August of 1981, I spent a month in Kenya and several days at Kenyatta National Hospital talking with expatriate doctors and others, Kenyan doctors, and you might have been one of them. You probably don't remember. I certainly don't, but when I saw that picture, I was there at that time. So in any event, my question is, a lot of trainees and students and beyond that sort of have their life blueprinted and planned out. They're going to take this step, they're going to get a residency, they're going to get a fellowship, they're going to do a postdoc and apply for a K, then they're going to get an R01. And your career is just an example of opportunity knocks, and you took it. And so my question is, you had so many branch points in your life. Looking back, do you have any regrets that you went left and you could have gone right, or you didn't take the right branch? Is there something that you could have done that you wish you had when the opportunity knocked? Because there were several knocking at the door. So that's my question.
Thank you, Dick. I do think about all of that. I sometimes, if you're introduced to give a talk, sometimes people say, Lenny did this, then that, and that. Sometimes I think, my Lord, if my mother were alive, she'd think, man, settle down. I think your question is very pertinent for younger colleagues, actually. Bill Foege, the legendary Bill Foege, former CDC director who died in January of this year, he used to say, he tells students and fellows and so on, don't make a life plan because life is too unpredictable. Medicine and science change too quickly. What you learn today, you're going to have to modify. But develop a life philosophy. What man or woman do you want to be? What's that sort of North Star that is going to guide you? And I think it's very useful advice for global health, where careers are not as straightforward as saying, I want to be a cardiologist, for example. And you do have to respect serendipity. Yogi Berra's famous comment, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. But you have to recognize the fork. And you do have to seize opportunity, and you require judgment because, don't do crazy, but you have to commit, and some of this stuff is unknown. So anyway, that's first sort of comments. Do I have personal regrets? I wish I had got formal training in epidemiology. I mean, truly formal training. It's enough to do, to some extent, this kind of field work, and field work is really important. It's the currency of global health. But and you apply the 80-20 rule. 20, whichever way around it is, you can do most of what you need to do with pretty simple, training. But epidemiology is such an elegant science, and I wish I was better at it. I miss clinical medicine, but you can't do everything. And I do think of the counterfactual. How would life have been? I could have stayed in hepatology, and what would have happened in hepatitis? I always say, I don't know. I see Dave here. I always say, I really don't know much about hepatitis C, because by the time I left liver disease, it hadn't been invented. And that's I think your question is one of the reasons, why do you write a book? Well, you hope that there's useful lessons that might be shared, but you write it for yourself to some extent also, to say, well, what did it all mean? Was it worth it? What were the conclusions? And as the famous saying is, life has to be, history is written backwards, but life has to be lived forwards. So.
I will say your first paper in the American Journal of Epidemiology, that's a pretty good credential, edited by the late George Comstock at that time, by the way. So if you pass muster with George, you're an epidemiologist. So we'll open it up to the room. Anyone have a question or comment for Eileen?
One of the scientific quotes about we only see what we look for and only recognize what we're familiar with. It's kind of an odd question, but when I saw that, I was struck by there's all this messaging to how we're being all replaced by AI, and AI can do the second half. It can be familiar with more things. I don't know that it is the first part, the being what you look for. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you apply that, or have applied, turning your gaze on what you're looking for.
Certainly, I think mentioning AI is important. It's not something I know anything about. It clearly is a force that we're going to have to live with and adapt to. And I would make an ancillary point that I think one of the failings, as I look back over the years of all the system strengthening and the Ebola work really drew it out for me, is that we underinvested greatly in data management in these countries, and it's kind of electronic chaos out there because every company trying to sell their latest, product. And I think that's a real problem. And AI raises if you add AI on top of all of that, I think we risk having an even greater digital divide than we already have, and that's going to have to be watched in global health. To answer your question, I don't know what, I mean, everybody says radiologists are going to go out of business and people reading cervical cytology and so on. I like to believe that humans are always going to have to be involved, that there is flexibility and complexity that machines initially at least deal with, but has to be watched and see and so on. What I would emphasize is the importance of asking the right question. It is so important. And Ebola was like, I mean, that first foray into Liberia, where there was an awful situation, absolutely awful. I mean, even dead people in the streets, and it was pretty indescribable. And you thought, this is chaotic, and how do you draw meaning out of that? Tony Fauci was educated by the Jesuits. He describes it in his book. I was educated by the Jesuits. I remember a quote he has used over the years, saying they tried to instill in him clarity of thought and economy of expression. And the clarity of thought is very important in all of this. Not sure that's a very satisfactory answer.
Okay.
I think those of us in global health have been feeling a little down lately, and this was just so inspiring. So, you touched a lot upon sort of like the intersections of politics in your work, bureaucracy, but you're also a scientist. And I think, for me in particular, like this idea of advocacy in science is something that I've always sort of struggled with. And I know it's so important in the AIDS epidemic, but COVID, I think, has scarred a lot of us. And so I just was wondering if you could reflect a little on how you feel about the role of advocacy from a scientist's perspective.
Thank you. A comment Harold Jaffe made, and he's absolutely right, the co-author of that first book, Dispatches from the AIDS Pandemic. He said in some ways it was easier in those days because we didn't have social media. And indeed, in the early 80s and 90s, when AIDS was being investigated, we did not have all this electronic communication, and CDC communicated by mail and the old slides and so on. And in a way, it was easier because I think it just gave people more time to think and prevented the sort of knee-jerk reactions to quite the same extent. I was also struck, by the way, by having worked on several different important but very different epidemics, AIDS, Ebola, COVID. I was struck by the differences biologically, but the similarities in sort of themes, societal response, discrimination, stigma, lots of things, and the basics of what's needed, of good science, first of all, but political leadership, community involvement, logistics to deliver whatever needs to be delivered, and communications. Communication is critically important. So I think advocacy and the AIDS epidemic and people we knew earlier on, I mean, the AIDS epidemic showed the importance of advocacy. And I think what really matters is you need to remember who you're talking to, because you can't talk to everybody the same way. We in this room can talk data and information, and it's what we live by. But most people don't. Most people respond to stories. They respond to an N of 1 or 2, not thousands. So I think that always has to be borne in mind. But advocacy, it will remain absolutely critical under, I think, the rubric of communications.
All right. Thanks, Kevin, so much. So I want to start off by thanking you. 25 years ago, for welcoming a young medical student to CDC Kenya, inviting him to dinner. And I really think that had a major effect on my entire career. question is, I'm sure you've mentored so many people in your career, you've been also so busy. Like, do you have a mentoring philosophy or a strategy when you have so many people who are kind of under you? And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that. Thank you.
Well, thanks. And it's good to see you, Larry. And you know, I think many people have respect. I do also greatly respect what you've done over the years. You don't, I mean, obviously you try and set a good example to the crowd, or whoever you work with, but the mentoring is more limited to individuals who, for one reason or another, you work with more closely or they seek you out. And of course, it's a two-way process because, you know, you do not necessarily want to be the old professor who, you know, you have to, who doesn't remember, you know, who likes to talk and who doesn't remember that every minute that you're talking is a minute you're not listening. And if you're not listening, you're not learning. So one does, you know, you have to remain humble, but you also have to get the balance right, I think. It's good to be humble, but too much of that, you know, is low self-esteem, and you don't want that. And, you know, it's good to be proud in one's work, but too much of that is arrogance, and that's insufferable. So it's very important to remain grounded, which it's a whole other discussion. And but I think that is an important context. I think anybody who's reasonably thoughtful, you know, will have introspection and an element of imposter syndrome even. But I think that's normal. Our political leaders might benefit from some of it. So yeah, those are just a few comments. Yeah, David.
Kevin, thank you for that and for your career. I wonder if you, when you were writing and thinking through this, if you reflected on the role of adversity and times when it was very difficult to press forward to achieve something and where there was sacrifice involved, and when how those trade-offs looked in that respect, and in personal and career.
Yeah. I think in a career in medicine or in health in general, in what we do, and especially, you know, when you get more senior and have responsibility of supervision, it's inevitable to have, I mean, it is inevitable. And I worry, my nephew is a medical student in Brussels, and, you know, he's passing all his exams with flying colors and stuff, and gets very, very anxious, and then does well. And I sort of think, you know, he needs to fail something to get calcium in the spine, because it will happen. It will happen. And you have, you know, you have to, nobody likes it, but you do have to learn to deal with it. And so, yeah, I think certainly there's been adversity in different aspects of a career and mistakes. And you know, again, it's sort of, I find one remembering mistakes more than necessarily successes, and they stay with you. And then as you get more senior, you know, criticism that is leveled at you and stuff. And there have been times when you wake up at night sort of anxious and worrying. And yet I think you have to persuade yourself, you know, don't take it personally. That it goes with it sort of goes with the field. And actually, I mentioned in the book, my father had later in his life, as he was retiring or stopping working with illness, ran into some trouble from which he was exonerated. But he wrote a letter that I saw later, in which he said, "Tall trees catch the wind." And you have to, you have to be able to not take it personally, because it goes with the terrain. And that's true, especially in big organizations as well. Yeah.
Thanks again, Kevin. We've had quite a bit of time to discuss a number of things. I do have one interesting question for you. In your section in the book, bureaucracy. So you're an individual who spent 30 years with CDC. and WHO. So you've seen sort of the element of bureaucracy of these institutions, as powerful and as mighty and as useful they really are. But they're also go by certain rigid standards. And yet your other part of your life, you're in the field and you're building programs in the field. You're out of that element of bureaucracy. How do you finesse that? You know, as an individual, I mean, you could have stayed at CDC, yet you chose to do the field work, to live in the field, to stay in the field. How did you manage that? And was that a fork in the road that you had to make that decision at some?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I mean, yes, these were forks in the road. And some of these decisions are influenced by personal circumstances, of course, also, you know, family issues and just life, you know, life that you have to deal with in addition to the work. I always felt more comfortable in a way in the field or I mean, even in the field, I was a bit of a bureaucrat, but later on, and to some extent, I sort of think it was just my Catholic upbringing and my Catholic guilt, because I often joke, my father was such a, you know, committed surgeon, but of the old school. He sort of could have grudgingly accepted that I did internal medicine. I wonder what he would have thought that I'd left clinical medicine. He said, you know, my son, you got lost. You know, I always felt I'm a doctor. I need to be doing the technical stuff. And yet, of course, supervisory positions are really important and they make a difference. And I mean, it affects the lives of thousands, millions, whatever. So these were difficult decisions, and I could have stayed. And to some extent, some of this is discussed in the book, in that in the, you know, thinking about how leaders work and stuff, we have a tendency to sort of revert to what we're most comfortable with as humans. And yet, if you're in a supervisory position, what you really need to ask is, what should I be doing that only I can do, and let other people do, you know, but there's a tendency to start interfering, because that's what I've always done, you know, and these are challenging issues, and the you know, senior people need to think about them. I saw Mary Glenn at the back, who I haven't seen for years.
Yeah.
I assume everybody knows Mary Glenn, who's such a hero in mother-child transmission work for HIV.
I wanted to thank you for all that you've done by both in the US, but also international contributions. And I guess where we are right now in terms of the anti-science and at such a high level, I'm struggling as an individual researcher. I just wondered, from your perspective, both internationally, how you deal with many kinds of bureaucracies and governments, but also looking at the US right now, what your advice or suggestions would be for individual researchers. It's just feeling paralyzed as to what would make a difference.
Maybe I should try and answer in two ways. One, for younger folks, it refers to one of the earlier questions. You know, global health is always going to be there. It's a difficult discipline, if you will, because it's so ill-defined, constantly evolving. Funding goes up and down. We're in a very difficult position now, but it'll always be there. And a career path depends on serendipity more than planning, because of what it is. Different from, I'm going to be a respiratory specialist or whatever. And I would advise younger people, get the right training, you know, get the right training, find that star that is yours. And no matter how bad things get or where you are, nobody can take away from you what you got in your head. In addition to that, if you work internationally, make sure you can always get a job back in your own country. That's very important. For researchers, there was a nice talk at CROI the other day that we've talked about by an activist who said, you know, we have to get out of this by going through it. And I think that's where we are. making contact with colleagues, the professional associations, for example. I'm very glad to see the pediatricians are actually giving advice about vaccines when you can't trust CDC anymore, et cetera, et cetera. So making the linkages, I think, is immensely important. Hopefully a lot even of the work, I hope, is protected. Some of it is not. And one has to find one's way and assume that this is not a permanent situation. But people also have to look after themselves, and you have to pay your mortgage or your rent and put food on the table. So I do recognize what a difficult time this is. But I think communicating with colleagues, activism, professional organization, affiliations, coalitions of the like-minded, etc. But it's tough times that I can certainly see.
All right, well, we're gonna have to wrap it up here. Your mentioning of the Jesuits several times makes me think as a college student, I canvassed for fighting Father Bob Drinan, Representative Robert Drinan from my district in Massachusetts, yours too, Eileen. And he was the congressman who filed impeachment papers against Nixon, the first impeachment act. But he was a Jesuit law school dean who was summarily retired by the Pope because of his political activism. But when I was canvassing for him, I knocked on a door with a leaflet, and this guy came out, and I handed it to him, and there's Father Bob. And he said something in Latin. I said, what? He said, behold the man who in his work pleases God. And I thought, oh, that's really profound. I'm glad he likes it. But anyway, behold you, your work has just really been spectacular. You've affected so many people, so many lives, so much policy. It really moved the world ahead. And I'm just so glad you've cataloged it in this book and that you were here today sharing it with us.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you, Nick. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's very kind.
And please feel free to come up
Yeah.
and get your book signed, have some more pizza, chat with Kevin.
That's